Over the last 4 years, I've reviewed movies and video games, but one particular genre that I've ironically been purposely avoiding are video game movies. For the past 20 years, Hollywood has tried their damnedest to make a profit on live-action video game adaptations. And I said live-action. I'm leaving out the animated films for this. The animated ones are the good movies that somehow don't get released in theaters. Which ones get released in theaters? The shitty live-action ones. Just for fun, I'm going to go down a list of video game adaptations that I've seen and give some quick reviews about them, describing both their positives and negatives. My two biggest problems with a lot of these video game adaptations is the lack of loyalty to the source material and the poor plots that are put in the place of the original source material. And this problem goes all the way back to the beginning with Super Mario Bros., which is the movie that started this whole thing. While it is a bad movie, in its defense, it has some legitimately good reasons on why they deviated so far from the source material. One, this was the first time that this had been done. Video game adaptations up to that point were only in Japan. America hadn't quite gotten there yet, so it would seem natural for writers to write something different because they weren't entirely sure on what they were doing for a genre that didn't exist at the time. So, they sort of wrote a story that didn't quite have a particular demographic to cater to. The movie seemed a bit too complicated for kids and far too dumb for adults. Also, it could be argued that the source material didn't present them a good enough plot to create a full-length story for. Let's face it, there wasn't much story to be told from the Mario games that were out at the time. It was just Mario saving the princess from King Koopa. That was it. So writers had to write a long enough story to fit a full-length movie. Granted, a 3-year-old could have written better, but I've learned to forgive this movie over time. However, one movie that I will never forgive is the movie that followed, Double Dragon. Classic game, crappy movie. This movie was so despised that it's one of very few movies on Rotten Tomatoes that has a 0. With this movie, the writers thought a video game adaptation would be best suited towards children. Fair enough, but I don't think children are this simple. The plot of the game was about two twin brothers out to save a love interest. It's a typical plot for a game, but obviously won't fly for a movie. But I would have taken the plot of the game over the plot of the movie any day. Add in bad acting and a cheap-looking production, and you have a film that will leave you horribly stunned. After another failure with Street Fighter, there was a slight improvement in Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat, while still crappy plot-wise, did feel more like a video game adaptation. The visual effects and the characters felt more loyal, and that alone was enough to really make this an enjoyable experience to sit through. And it's generally the movie that most gamers bring up when they're talking about video game adaptations. I would say there was no reason for the bad plot, but in all honesty, the Mortal Kombat games were not plot-driven and were just straightforward fighting games, so I wasn't nearly as surprised by the bad plot. However, they waited for the sequel to make something completely terrible. Mortal Kombat Annihilation is dumb to say the very least. Again, the games have no set plot device to them, so the writers have to make one up. I would much rather play an hour and a half of the game rather than watching an hour and a half of this movie. The plot is simple, it's just the main characters from the first movie going up against Shao Kahn and Sindel. It's simple but presented in the stupidest way possible. Unbelievably slow action and an uninteresting story equals a really unwatchable movie. The next video game adaptation that I watched after that was Tomb Raider. While the plot is still not perfect, Tomb Raider was a major improvement in presentation. The production value was greater, it had an imaginative director in Simon West, and the casting was really well done with Angelina Jolie taking on the role of the popular video game character Lara Croft. While the plot still showed flaws, it remained close enough to the game and was tolerable for a movie plot, which said a lot for this genre at the time. It wasn't quite as entertaining as Mortal Kombat, but Tomb Raider showed that these movies were capable of making money. In fact, Tomb Raider still stands as the only video game adaptation to gross over $100 million in America. After Tomb Raider, everyone thought the quality of these movies would improve. Then we got Resident Evil. I still can't figure out how this movie got the Resident Evil name. At what point did the creators look at this classic survival horror series and say, you know what I see? I see a lousy, unfrightening action movie. You know, because that's what we all saw when we played the classic games. I'll give them credit for borrowing some of the plot elements from the series, but the fact that this offers as much scares as Scary Movie is a huge letdown, and the horrific acting doesn't help. I would say something about the sequels, but I haven't watched them. Until this series changes its title, I'm not watching them. This is not Resident Evil, and it does not deserve that great title. The next adaptation I decided to sit through was Tomb Raider: The Cradle of Life, which was the sequel to the first Tomb Raider, and much like Resident Evil, it doesn't feel like the game series that it represents. In fact, since its release, I'm convinced that this was written for another movie but somehow got turned into a sequel for Tomb Raider. I guess they felt since the games at that time had gone away from the main gameplay of the original Tomb Raider, why not stray as far away from the first movie's concept in the movie's sequel? The Cradle of Life plotline feels like something that J.K. Rowling would write up. However, she would write it much better. At least with the first movie, they went with something that would fit in with the Tomb Raider games, while this story feels more meant for another fantasy film. I took a long break from this genre for a few years due to lack of interest in the titles that were being adapted. Either way, it wasn't like Doom or Blood Rain were classics. In fact, I recently sat down to watch Doom and I nearly cried because of what I saw. One of my absolute favorite first-person shooters, and it's one of the worst written, worst acted, and worst directed movies that I've ever seen. Id Software made sure that Doom was high in quality and addicting to play, while Doom the movie fails in quality and is only good to sit through for about 2 minutes. The next movie that I would actually sit down in theaters to watch would be Silent Hill. Silent Hill is easily my favorite out of all of the adaptations that have come out. This is how a video game adaptation should be. It should be loyal to the game, but should also be a good movie. Silent Hill got the tone, look, and story 100% correct. Sure, there were some things that were changed because it had to be turned into a movie, but that was expected. Silent Hill literally felt like the game had come to life, and that's how these movies should feel. A lot of people did show some displeasure with the changing of the leads. Instead of the father looking for his daughter, it was a mother looking for her daughter. However, it turned out to be a pretty wise move. In the land of film, we tend to feel more sympathy for the female rather than the male. I'm not quite sure how that is, but it always seems to work in the land of film, and I've learned to accept that. Silent Hill the movie was what the game was. It was scary, creepy, and above all, it was entertaining, and that's how these movies should be. The next film is a guilty pleasure for me, and it's a film that fans are very divided on, and that's Hitman. While panned by critics, Hitman is actually decent considering the game it's based on. Let's face it, the Hitman franchise, while very cool, was never really story-driven. All you were was, well, a hitman. Obviously, this did not give writers much to go on. Sure, the hitman element is easy to write for, but you need a plot and story or else it's not a movie. So they wrote in a love story, which is where most fans are divided on. Another element that has fans split is on the personality of Agent 47 himself. Agent 47 in the game is a very humorless and robot-like character. In the movie, he's a little more down-to-earth and made easier to relate to in a way. I can understand why fans are split, but I thought it was a pretty well-written story and is one of those rare moments where I agreed on the decision to explore more into the character than what was already revealed in the games. The acting, while not perfect, is still good, and the action and fight scenes are very well done. So I feel this is a good movie to sit through. Because of my liking for Silent Hill and Hitman, I was really looking forward to the next and last movie that I'll discuss, and that's Max Payne. Anyone who knows me knows how much I love the first two Max Payne games. They are two of my favorite games. They were two of the best written stories ever for video games, and the gameplay was straightforward and addicting. There were many questions asked on why the game was even being turned into a movie, mainly because the game was like watching a movie anyways. However, that didn't kill my excitement. Max Payne already had a movie-like story that should have been easy to translate to film. How could they possibly screw that up? You want to know how? By going as far away from the source material as humanly possible. Literally, who the hell greenlighted this script? They could have given this movie another name and changed the names of the characters, and you would have never known that this was based on Max Payne. That's how far out this movie went from the game. The only positive remark I have towards this movie is Mark Wahlberg's surprisingly decent performance as Max Payne, and I doubted him when he got casted. Granted, I can picture several other actors more qualified for the role, but he did a good job regardless, and I like Mark Wahlberg as an actor anyways. But does that save the movie? Not even close. So overall, video game adaptations clearly do best when they're loyal to the source material. I'm fine with a few changes here and there, but when you completely go away from the source material, it's not going to be any good. They're like comic book adaptations, but video game adaptations are rarely treated with the same respect as comic films, and I can't figure out why. Well everyone, that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.